We recently just released a report on other post-employment benefit liabilities. So kind of in the same vein as the pension plans, but this relates to things like healthcare plans and different things like that.
He is the director of the Tax and Fiscal Policy Task Force for ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. Love having them on the program any chance we get. Mr. Nick Stark on the line here. Nick, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing good. How about yourself?
Hey, we are doing great. Happy Friday. So good that you could join us. This is a fascinating topic of states' retirement plans and how we rank nationwide based on each individual state, because there are many of them that are doing well and have their ducks in a row, so to speak, and are properly preparing for their retirement plans for their state employees, and other states that not so much. How are we faring right now across the nation?
Yeah, well, just a minuscule $7 trillion in debt as far as it goes for the unfunded liabilities. You figure that's only a fifth of what the federal debt's at, but that amounts to, if you kind of flesh that out to what the burden of that would be if the bill comes due and the states have to pay that, it's about $21,000 per person. I don't know about you, but I can't afford to do that sort of pay up $21,000 to the government to pay down these pensions. So really the headline is we're not doing so great across the nation on pension plans here.
That is not good. Now, on average, and I know obviously this varies by state, but on average, what is the percentage of a state budget that goes towards something like the state retirement plans?
Yeah, I'm not sure the specific, but it is a large portion, like you said, and I think it varies state to state on how it looks in the budget specifically. But I think one of the things to kind of look at, when you talk about how well are these things funded, is things like the funding ratios for these, because that kind of gives you an idea of you have the outstanding liabilities and then the percentage of that that's funded. And most of the states don't even have 50% of their unfunded liabilities, funded. So each year that's going to be billions and billions of dollars that come out of the budget to go towards paying these pension plans. And, it's a lot of money.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line.
Yeah. Now, for those that may not understand, when you talk about some of the unfunded liabilities, talk about this process and how we come to this, how we understand this. So we have a pension plan in a state, and we have to pay obviously a certain amount into it. So that way the people that are on it and then the future people that potentially will be on it with all these benefits actually get paid, and we have the cash for that. But when we talk about an unfunded liability, how is that calculated?
Yeah. So we do it through a lot of different like contribution rates, that sort of thing, growth assessments, that sort of thing. And really it's a projection for what states are going to have to pay on down the road. So, what they pay out current year is often what gets paid into the budget. But, if you're legally obligated, either through the statutes, in your state or through the Constitution in your state to pay down these, to pay out these pensions in future years, that number can balloon if you've got somebody that's, 25 just entering the workforce and they're going to work for the next, 50 years of their life, let's say. And, then they're going to expect to collect benefits. That's a lot of accrued benefits. And so we do a couple different accounting practices to kind of have a fixed rate for what you can expect to get out of your investments from what, is contributed in the meantime. And the bottom line is that not enough is being contributed at the moment.
Yeah, what a concept. It kind of reminds me of the way Social Security is being done at the federal level, to where we're paying into it, but it's paying for somebody on it right now. And then the federal government comes in and just borrows from it anyways, to where we don't have the money. And eventually that program's not going to function very well, right?
Exactly. And that's how I often explain it to people is, I think of like the interns that I have to explain this to, every summer. They understand Social Security and how they're not going to get that, but pensions work very similarly in that, you're not, unless it's constitutionally in the state's constitution, you're not necessarily going to get those benefits later on down the road. And that's why we talked about, one of the reforms for this is switching from something that's a defined benefit where you're obligated to a payout, you're entitled to a payout from the state, to something like a 401k style, what we call a defined contribution, to where the employees putting in, the state matches, that sort of thing. And you can profit a lot more from that too, I think, in the long run.
Yeah. When we talk about either the retirement plans or Social Security, since that's kind of a great example for this, where are we with the young generation being able to receive some of these? Obviously, Social Security is set to, go bankrupt if we don't do anything in like the next 30 years or so. My generation, I'm 35, probably not going to see something like that unless we do some drastic changes right now. And we see the ongoing, especially for pension plans at statewide and at federal levels, we see the size of government, the public employee side, continue to grow. We talk about jobs being built by the Biden administration. The vast majority of jobs that are being grown right now are public sector jobs at statewide levels. The biggest growth sector is the public sector jobs. This is putting an additional burden onto already what's broken, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, in terms of like if you're just entering the workforce as a public employee, I think you can be pretty certain that you're going to receive your pension payout later on in your life, unless your state is more statutory, because then it's easier if it's statutory protection, because then it's easier to undo that sort of thing. I think as far as the payout, states are always going to figure out how to do it. It's just, do they issue debt? How do they fund it? That sort of thing. But you have, and we recently just released a report on other post-employment benefit liabilities. So kind of in the same vein as the pension plans, but this relates to things like, healthcare plans. And different things like that. And I think those have, you talk about here in Kansas specifically, those are easier to get rid of short term. So it's highly likely that you might not even see those. Kansas hit a point where, they had a budget crisis. They had to cut some programs. And one of the first things to go was the OPEB plans. So, if it's not constitutionally guaranteed, if there's not some mechanism that makes it difficult to overturn the obligation for the state to pay down these plans, there's a good chance you won't see it.
That is unfortunate. We're talking with Nick Stark. He is the director of the Tax and Fiscal Policy Task Force for ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. Let's talk about, we got a couple minutes before we have to take a break here. Let's talk about the best and worst states in the nation right now. You guys have come out with your ranking on some of the best unfunded liabilities and worst unfunded liabilities by state with these retirement plans. So let's start at the top. What states are doing the best right now nationwide on this program?
Yeah. So if you talk about total unfunded liabilities, your top five are going to be Vermont, South Dakota, North Dakota, Delaware, and Wyoming. And that's typically because there's smaller populations.
Easier to manage.
Exactly, that sort of thing. But in the per capita, those don't always translate over into the top five as well. But the bottom five are kind of your usual suspects, the ones that have a lot of public employees, large government states. California is the worst in the nation. They've got, just by themselves, they've got over, $1 trillion in unfunded pension liabilities, followed by Illinois, as you mentioned, who's just a debacle, and then Texas, New York, and Ohio.
Wow. $1 trillion. How do you come back from $1 trillion in the hole on a program like this and are promising? I mean, you're essentially giving out IOUs and saying, we promise we'll pay for your retirement when you actually retire. How do you come back from something like that?
Well, I tell you, it's certainly not with, the $100 billion budget deficit or whatever the current California budget deficit is. It's not with that sort of thing. But, like I said, it's changing the structure of it is a large portion of it. If you switch from that defined benefit plan to the defined contribution, you're likely not to continue accruing the unfunded liabilities, and then you can start paying down those liabilities as you go, as people start, realizing some of those benefits.
Yeah, that it's not actually going to work. Yeah. Nick, hang on the line. We got to take a hard break here. We're talking with Nick Stark, director of the Tax and Fiscal Policy Task Force with ALEC. When we come back, I want to talk about how we can start changing some of these states and some of the examples of maybe some turnaround states that have figured this out and started going in the right direction. Hanging out with Nick Stark. He is with the American Legislative Exchange Council. He's the director of the Tax and Fiscal Policy Task Force, talking about the failed retirement plans at the statewide level. How do we get them back on track? Which I have to ask you, Nick, we mentioned Illinois because I remember it made big news a few years ago when they couldn't fund it and they had to file for bankruptcy, essentially. Now we see Greece kind of doing the same thing on a national scale because they couldn't handle some of the expenses they have. We continue to grow this public sector all over because we just think the government's going to solve all our issues. What's the breaking point, do you think, here? Because it seems like more states are going down this road. Yeah.
Well, I think, Illinois is a classic example of what not to do. in every single regard. I think Illinois is actually going to continue to see these issues in the future because every time they go to fix it, it's only a temporary solution. And then ultimately they pay it down with things like bonds, and then their credit rating starts to slide because they can't pay off the bonds and all sorts of, crazy stuff. One of the issues with Illinois is that I think there's a recognition that they need to change, how they do things with their pension plans, but it's so constitutionally enshrined that they actually can't get some of the tweaks that they need to it without altering the Constitution in the state. We talk about fixing things. Like I said, it's the defined benefit model, the defined contribution. Ooh, don't tell my bosses I said that. It's the defined contribution model is, the way to go with things. Because like I said, it works like a 401k. You make sure you can pay out what the state and the employee have contributed over, the years of work that they put in.
Yeah. Are there states that you've seen that have been an example where they've gone to that system? They realized it didn't work. They started to go into this better system, and that they've been able to turn things around. Are there success stories out there right now?
Yeah, there's a couple of them. And we've had some tremendous reform in this regard in the last year even. We've always kind of joked that it really only happens about once a decade. You had Michigan in the 90s, you had Alaska in the 2000s, Oklahoma in the 2010s. And then just recently we had a big win up in North Dakota. I think North Dakota was one of the free market, the less talked about free market wins that happened this year, in that not only did they cut taxes, but they fixed their pension plan as well by making that switch to the defined contribution model. Yeah. But it's like any other reform that you make that's free market oriented. There's always going to be those that come out to attack it and try to bring it back to the old system. And we're seeing that in places like Oklahoma and Alaska that have had that for a couple of years. And so I think it's, in one sense, making the argument that in some of these states, and pointing to states like North Dakota and all these that have made the switch, making the argument that those work, but also going back to those states and saying, hey, we need to defend these ideas. Look how good this is doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm curious on what the argument is against them going back to an old system like that. And I know the other side likes to use examples for healthcare, for retirement, for, vacation, for all the, what Bernie Sanders like to say is, look at Scandinavia, look at the great socialist nations we have over in Scandinavia with Denmark and Sweden and what they're doing. But they have a system that's similar to this, don't they? They have the defined contributions that are very much tied into the private sector.
Yeah, and I think the common, argument against it is that the defined benefit is ultimately going to provide you more in payout when you retire. But that's not always accurate. I think you have an opportunity to earn more when you pay into a 401k style system. Yeah. And they argue this because it's based on a multitude of multipliers, from what your final salary was to your years of service, and then always some kind of arbitrary, state.
It's all the tenured stuff. Oh, I was there for so long, and I may not have done anything, but you're just going to be guaranteed that amount. So they love it, which is, instead of the free market system of you actually get back the amount that you actually put into it based on your effort and how you tried to work up the chain.
Exactly.
What a concept, right? It's wild. Nick, we're out of time, my friend. I love this conversation. It is fascinating to see, and hopefully states can start working on this and start addressing these issues, because we have some serious work to do. It's Nick Stark, American Legislative Exchange Council. Nick, we appreciate the time, brother. Let's get you back on again real soon.
All right. Thank you very much.
Hey, appreciate it. Great conversation. Good stuff.